A millionaire is found dead in his South Florida mansion after an odd 911 call.
So how is that an accident?
How's it an accident? The guy fell down the stairs and he's dead.
They said, holy cow, we got an issue here.
The body was inside of his sleeping bag. There was a fitted sheet.
I opened up the bag a little bit further, pulled some of the stuff apart, and I saw a hand.
A bizarre and complex crime scene raises more questions than answers.
For me as an investigator, I'm like, what are you doing here, with the attorney?
This was a lot more than just an accident.
He would drink a bit too much, and that, I think, caused some rift between the two of them.
But with multiple witnesses and conflicting stories, investigators must determine what's true and what's a cover-up.
She said to me, he wanna bury in the ocean.
She's, 85 pounds, maybe 5 something. Somebody had to help her. 2 people were there, and no one else knew what the story was.
Fort Lauderdale, Florida is a place most people associate with relaxation.
Fort Lauderdale is a vacation spot. It's a hot spot for taking cruises to go to the Bahamas and everywhere else. We have 7 miles of ocean beach that you can go to.
On June 28, 2011, police are called to the scene of a fatal accident on one of the area's more affluent streets.
911, what is your emergency?
We need a detective at Coconut Drive, Fort Lauderdale, please.
Okay, what's going on there, sir?
We had an accident. A person fell down the stairs.
Okay, do they need paramedics?
Not anymore.
So how is that an accident?
How's it an accident? The guy fell down the stairs and he's dead.
It wasn't frantic when he called 911. I don't want to say he acted as it was another day at the office, but something just doesn't seem right.
When the police arrived, they discovered the body of Ronald Vinci. Present at the scene were Catherine Pileggi, Mr. Vinci's significant other, an attorney named Sam Fields, and a close friend of Ronald Vinci named Spencer Gordon.
The attorney identified himself and said, I am representing Miss Pileggi. What are you doing here, with the attorney, with Spencer? Why are you here? That was kind of suspicious.
Spencer Gordon tells police he's the one who called 911. When he leads the officers to Ron's body, they realize the situation does not match the story they were told.
The story at that point was that he had apparently fallen down the stairs, which was confounding to the police.
The body, we're thinking, is at the bottom of the stairs, but once you go in the entrance, you go to the right, you walk into the bedroom, and there's a big bed. That's where the body was at.
The body was inside of this sleeping bag. There was a fitted sheet, I believe. There was a towel. There were multiple elements to all of the coverings directly around the decedent.
His body looked like a big clump of dirty laundry sitting off to the right side of your bed. Once they saw that, they said, holy cow, we got an issue here. We wondered how he could get from the bottom of the stairs into the bedroom.
Since it appears the body has already been moved, officers clear the scene to preserve any potential evidence.
They immediately shut it down and called us out there. Catherine Pileggi was being detained in a patrol car as a person of interest or a possible suspect. And the crime scene was sealed. So no one goes in until at least the ME goes in there, and then the scene is processed.
It was such a complex scene, meaning the scene directly around the decedent, and not knowing what would be in there. I thought it would be better just to wrap everything up, not disturb anything, and just put the entire unit in a body bag and have it transported. The assumption is that at this point, because of the context of the scene, that this is a homicide.
Then we decide our plan of attack here. What are we gonna do?
The bigger thing is to collect as much of the evidence as possible, and because we just never know what is going to be important.
While investigators are securing evidence, detectives learn more about who is at the scene.
Before you start looking for the boogeyman who may have entered and fled, you look to see who in the immediate area who could have been involved and find out what they know.
Mr. Pileggi was taken downtown, and then our witnesses the same thing, just to get them away from the scene and we can talk to them and try to get their version of what happened. What is the story behind all this?
Ronald Vinci was born in Ohio on August 16, 1940, but he lived most of his life in California. A salesman at heart, Ron was drawn to a career in auto sales, and he spent decades becoming one of the most successful dealers in the state.
Ron was a self-made man. I would characterize him as being very street smart. Back in the day, nobody really knew how successful Honda Motors would be, but he made a real success out of it. You couldn't hide how much money the boy had.
He had yachts. He had a motorcycle collection. This was not somebody who was scraping by.
Ron married in his early 20s and had a son. But after many years together, the relationship ended in divorce, and Ron's focus turned back to his work and some rather expensive hobbies.
I met Ron Vinci in a small town called Lake Havasu, Arizona, and we found we had similar interests. We liked boats, we liked airplanes, we liked water, those types of things. Ron was a very fun guy. You wanted to be around him from any standpoint, from a social event to going down to the Bahamas. He had just a zest for life that was unparalleled.
In 1993, at the age of 53, Ron decided it was time to cash out and enjoy the fruits of his labor.
When Mr. Vinci retired and sold his interest in the Honda dealerships that he had a lot of money, which he spent on toys and property and travel.
On one of his luxury trips, Ron got a second chance at love when he met a 37-year-old woman from Georgia named Catherine Pileggi.
Kathy grew up in rural Augusta. He had a pretty large family. I think she was probably the oldest of 5 or 6 children. She was extremely close with both of her parents and with most of her siblings. She's a real lady, a humble lady, a very kind and considerate person.
She was a flight attendant when they met. You know, people normally date within an age range. And, you know, he got somebody who was fairly significantly younger than him.
I met Kathy about the same time that I met Ron. They were always an item. They had been together for many years, and she was just a really nice person. Kathy was a very good-looking, gorgeous woman. I think that she was somewhat of a trophy girlfriend. You know, my girlfriend's an airline stewardess, and she's a hottie.
Despite their age difference, Catherine and Ron found they shared many things in common, including a taste for the high life.
Earlier in their relationship, they shared a joy and a passion for flying. Kathy was a pilot. She was actually a better pilot than Ron was, and used to do most of the flying wherever they would go. And there were many trips that they would take all over the country and throughout the Caribbean.
The couple spent the next 20 years jet-setting before putting down roots in southern Florida.
He purchased a 2-story home in one of Fort Lauderdale's richest, ritziest neighborhoods that he shared with Catherine.
Although they never married, Catherine and Ron seemed to have the kind of relationship most only dream of.
The two of them attended functions all the time, gala events. They enjoyed the good life.
But 2 weeks after moving into the new mansion, their high-flying lifestyle has come to a tragic end. After securing the crime scene, detectives bring the 3 potential witnesses in for questioning.
We need to identify almost immediately, okay, who are my key players here that I need to talk to, and then separate from the scene.
Investigators start with interviewing Catherine, who requests to have her lawyer present.
And did you understand your rights as I have read them to you? And you are willing or not willing to make a statement now in reference to this? Yes.
Not willing.
After getting nowhere with Catherine, in a separate room, her lawyer provides some startling information.
Put it this way, this was a lot more than just an accident.
Coming up, a witness reveals a sinister discovery.
Eventually, he got her to say, okay, he was shot.
And an autopsy reveals the details of a brutal murder.
There were bludgeoning marks from a hammer in his skull.
It was overkill, so we know it's personal.
Fort Lauderdale police are questioning everyone who was at Ron Vincey's mansion the night he was reported to be deceased. Ron's girlfriend, Catherine, isn't willing to make a statement, but in a separate room, her attorney reveals some disturbing details.
He said, you'll find blunt force trauma, you'll find stab wounds, you'll find gunshot wounds, on the body. Well, only a person that would have been there or committed it would have known the injuries. So now we're thinking, okay, well, is that a confession? Just so many questions and so many things that were going on that we didn't have answers to.
Catherine's attorney refuses to elaborate, so detectives turn their attention to the man who called 911, Spencer Gordon.
You work for Ron.
No, I work for Ron. Ron and I are just friends. I fly his helicopter, I fly his airplane, occasionally.
Spencer had told us the night before, on the 27th, Spencer Gordon, Miss Pileggi, and Mr. Vincey. They were all there, had dinner, Chinese food, and had some wine and socialized. According to Spencer, they left about 7:30 that evening. As far as he's concerned, Mr. Vincey was alive and well.
He was passed out or asleep.
He's what?
Asleep or passed out, who knows which.
Spencer tells detectives Ron was something of a party animal, so he didn't think much of him passing out in the living room. But the next morning, he was surprised to get an emergency call from someone who works for Ron.
Ronaldo Silva, he was a handyman, but he did a lot of gardening work among his other duties. He called Spencer Gordon, who he knew to be a close friend of Ronald Vincey.
I called him back at 10:42 and asked him what the problem was.
Right.
And at that time, he said, I can't find Ron passed. That was his exact words, Ron passed, which I took to mean Ron passed out.
Right.
I said, all right, calm down, let's go over there and let's see what's happening. Got in the car, we went over there.
When Spencer arrived at the house to check on Ron, he quickly realized the situation was much worse than he imagined.
This was Catherine.
She was in the foyer. Ronaldo at that time was trying to get me to go into the back bedroom to see what was going on a little bit further, pull some of the stuff apart, and I saw a hand. When I saw that, I knew there was an issue.
Before he made the 911 call, he confronted Catherine Pileggi about it, and her initial version was he fell down the stairs.
I said, when did this happen? She said about 1 o'clock or 1:30 in the morning. And I said, what did you do? She just stared, didn't say anything. I said, Kathy, you gotta tell me what happened here.
Spencer said eventually he got her to say, okay, he was shot.
She told you there's a bullet hole in him?
That's what she said.
They were in an argument, heated argument, got into something, and that she shot him.
I said, all right, what do you want to do? I don't want to go to jail. I said, I understand that, but what do you want to do? I said, here's my phone, call 911. Let's see what happens here. No, I don't want to call 911. I said, well, if you're not calling, she said, no, don't do that. I walked out to the front and called 911.
And at some point you felt she needed an attorney, so you called an attorney for her.
What I did is I called my friend, and this is after calling 911. I asked, does he have an attorney there that's a criminal attorney? He said, yes.
But when investigators review the specifics of the 911 call, it doesn't match what Spencer just told them.
Are there any weapons involved?
No, I don't know.
For us, that was weird. Why not just simply say, hey, I need help, I need an ambulance, the guy's been shot. He just says somebody fell into the deceased. That takes thought. And you're starting to say, okay, this guy's not being truthful.
Detectives confront Spencer about the discrepancy.
There's a lot more detail here now than what you gave in your first statement that...
Absolutely. I don't know. I won't tell you I was in shock, man. I'm still in shock now.
After getting nowhere with the witnesses, police are forced to release everyone.
They wanted to interview Miss Pileggi, but she exercised a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent.
We were told that, okay, let's go ahead and release her for the moment, and Spencer Gordon, because we don't have a confession. We don't really know what happened and whether she's the person that did it.
With hopes of getting more answers, they ask the handyman Reynaldo Silva to come in for questioning.
O detetive de Jesus me ligou de manhã e ele perguntou se eu poderia ir lá na delegacia. Na hora que eu cheguei lá, ele falou, me conta tudo que você sabe.
Today, 1 o'clock in the morning, she called me. I have it here in my phone. She called in Ron's phone.
She called you using Ron's phone?
In Ron's phone. Then she said to me, Ray, you have to rent a truck tomorrow because I rent a truck before.
Nunca recebi ordem da Cat. O tempo inteiro, Ron. Eu say, okay, 1:45 in the morning, then I go back to the bed. That day, something like 7:45, I called the house. Ron's phone. She answered the phone, then she say, Ray, come straight to the house.
Then I go inside, then she come, cried and say to me, Ron's passed.
Ron's what?
Passed, died.
Ron passed?
Yeah.
Say, why? She fell from the stair. Then she say to me, Ron have to be, he wanna bury in the ocean.
She wants you to help her.
To take him in the boat.
To take him in the boat.
Throw in the water.
I just say, I wanna see Ron. Quando ela me levou para ver o corpo, ele não estava na cama onde eu respeitava, com vela. Ele estava enrolado do lado da cama.
Reynaldo says he immediately suspected foul play.
Eu acho que ela é responsável porque ela me ligou de madrugada, ela me mostrou o corpo, queria que eu jogasse no mar. Não liguei para polícia porque fiquei com medo. Medo de quê? Medo de não ser entendido porque não tinha o inglês que eu sei que é pobre ainda. Eu queria pedir ajuda. Eu não sabia o que eu ia fazer. Eu queria ligar para o Spencer. He said, I'll be there.
Ron and Spencer is good friends. He's together all the time. So I talk to him, say, hey, is the situation? I see the body. I don't see the face, but I see the thing. Then he said to me, you have to see Ron.
I don't think she expected him to call Spencer Gordon. He was very traumatized by it. You know, like he told me, again, he's very emotional about it when he talked about it. And he couldn't believe that this had happened. Was it the handyman? No. I don't think it was the handyman. I think he was too traumatized by what happened.
Investigators wrap up their questioning with Ronaldo and shift focus back to the crime scene to shed further light on what happened. The first thing they find is a large bin and dive weights.
This would come in handy if you wanted to dispose of a body at sea and make sure no one found it. You would imagine that this would be suspicious.
They also discover evidence of a hasty cleanup.
By the naked eye, there was no blood there. You can clean some areas with Clorox and completely clean it as clean as you think it could be. But luminol will bring it out and you could see it.
Detectives luminoled the tile floor by the bottom of the staircase and found bloodstains.
The blood trail led to the first floor bedroom and then into, on the bed and where everything else was at. So they tested it and determined that it was Mr. Vincey's blood. But if it happened in that hallway at the bottom of the stairs, how did he get into the bedroom? Maybe she just pulled him and dragged him. If you look at Miss Pileggi, she's 85 pounds, maybe 5 something. So for this woman of such small stature, to have done this, something just doesn't seem right. I want the whole story.
On June 29, 2011, the day after Ron Vincey died, the medical examiner conducts a full autopsy of his body. Detectives believe the results will confirm if Ron fell down the stairs or was shot by his long-term girlfriend, Catherine Pileggi.
We still didn't know what we were going to find in the autopsy. The body bag is x-rayed with the decedent and all the wrappings in it. Once we look at the x-rays, we have a feel for anything like bullets. The x-ray gave a clue as to there was very likely a gunshot wound. And then immediately you can see the sharp force injuries on the neck and blunt force injuries to the head. He also had a large bruise on his chest. He had a gunshot wound to the left side of his head, and it had fractured his skull and actually lacerated his brain. He had, I believe it was 7 incised wounds on his neck and 5 stab wounds to his trunk.
Whoever killed Ronald Vincey wanted to make sure he was not getting up.
It was overkill. And anytime we go to a scene where we see that the injuries sustained are overkill, then we know it's personal.
As far as detectives are concerned, Catherine's refusal to cooperate with their investigation makes her the prime suspect.
We suspected who may have done it, but we have to tie the suspect to the crime scene. We spent 3 or 4 days at the house.
In Ron's Bentley, they find a treasure trove of evidence.
In the trunk were several plastic bags filled with items that turned out to be of evidentiary significance. Most significantly was a .380 handgun, a knife that appeared to have blood on it, and a hammer. On the .380 handgun's magazine were fingerprints that were subsequently matched to Catherine Pileggi.
Is that the same firearm that Mr. Vincey, was killed with? We don't know. But according to Spencer Gordon, she's handled those firearms. So the fingerprints could have been in there from who knows whenever. We continued our investigation. We determined that she had made purchases, on her credit card. She had actually went out and purchased a bin at Home Depot. She had gone to Brownies, which is a dive shop, purchased some weights, dive weights, that allegedly she was going to use to take a victim's body out in the ocean and dump them. The receipts show it was her. The video surveillance showed it was her. There was no one else with her.
The purchases are consistent with what the handyman Reynaldo told police. But what's also suspicious is when Catherine bought some of the items.
The weights had been purchased the day before the body was discovered. It was a red flag because if she was planning to do this ahead of time, this would be an earmark of premeditated murder.
The questions facing investigators now are, why would Catherine plan the murder of her longtime boyfriend? And did she have help trying to dispose of his body? When they ask friends of the couple, they discover the relationship was more volatile than it appeared.
Ron and I went to breakfast 2 or 3 times a week. He didn't share with me what the problem between the two of them was, but it was apparent to me that Ron would drink a bit too much. And that, I think, caused some rift between the two of them.
They had reached the point, clearly, according to their friends, this relationship was not going to go very much further.
Catherine and Ron even separated for a few months in 2000.
One of the times that we went to breakfast, he disclosed to me the potential settlement agreement that Kathy had asked for. And that was, she wanted a new car, she wanted $100,000, and she wanted the penthouse that she was living in. Ron asked me my opinion if I thought that was the right thing to do. And I told him that it was. I told him I think it was an easy out. But I guess that didn't happen.
But friends say after their time apart, they wound up reconciling. So if Catherine was back in Ron's good graces, what was her motive for killing him? The day after Ron's murder, police learn of another suspicious death.
In talking with some of Miss Pileggi's closest friends, we were told that she blamed Mr. Vinci for her sister's death. They were out at some soiree somewhere in the Caribbean or something like that. Her sister became sick, and allegedly Mr. Vinci gave her some of his medication. But at some time thereafter, obviously the sister passed. She blamed him for her death. Certainly there was a lot of anger there. Could that be motive?
Sometimes a heat of passion can be so great that it might negate conscious intent to kill.
Coming up, Catherine finally opens up and reveals claims of self-defense.
She realized, oh, this time he really meant it. He really was going to kill me.
But is she telling the truth?
There was no question in my mind she had developed battered woman syndrome.
Armed with evidence linking Catherine Pileggi to the death of her boyfriend, Ron Vinci, Florida police obtain a warrant for her arrest on July 5th, 2011.
At this point, based on witness testimony, based on the evidence collected at the scene and processed, we submitted it to the Commonwealth Attorney's Office to say, I think we have enough probable cause to arrest her.
But now, Catherine has hired a new attorney, Bruce Udolph.
I got the call from Fort Lauderdale police asking me to bring her down to self-surrender. She did so.
Our crime scene folks photographed her, fingerprinted her. We got DNA swabs from her.
She was charged with murder in the first degree.
Once again, Catherine refuses to give a statement to police. Months later, when Catherine is evaluated by a forensic psychologist, her version of events finally comes to light.
She confessed that she had shot Mr. Vinci.
But Catherine claims it had nothing to do with money or her sister's death. According to her, she was a long-term victim of domestic abuse.
She was going to offer a defense that what she did was an overreaction due to battered spouse syndrome, when in some way, shape, or form this was really self-defense on her part.
She said he had two personalities. She said, he'd be nice as ever. And then he could do a flip on you in a heartbeat and become the meanest person, in the world.
He would just drink, become very boisterous. He would bump into people, or he would be obnoxious. And I think he was being somewhat too obnoxious to Kathy from time to time. I actually told him if he didn't quit being obnoxious, I was going to throw his ass overboard over the side of the boat.
In addition to that, he was taking lots of different medications, which had a variety of effects on him, including hallucinations, losses of consciousness.
Catherine claims she suffered in silence for more than a decade. But on the night of June 27, 2011, she decided she'd had enough.
She said he had an argument at the top of the stairs. She was trying to keep a condominium that she liked to live in on Las Olas Boulevard from being sold. And he blamed her for the deal not going through. And we know this only from her words. He stuck a gun in her face.
He was so drunk and out of it from all the drugs that he was taking that he fell backwards and fell down and hit his head at the bottom of the stairs. He's not bleeding that much, but she wipes up all the blood and she puts him on a rug so she could pull him into a bedroom. She puts him in bed. She finishes cleaning up. It took probably about a half an hour by her estimate. She gets dressed. She goes downstairs and she sees the gun, sees the clip is half out. It was a semi-automatic. And that the gun had jammed. And she realized, oh, this time he really meant it. He really was going to kill me. And that's when she takes the gun and goes into the bedroom, sees him lying there.
She described how she raised that gun, closed her eyes, and squeezed the trigger. She says, the next thing I know, I'm standing over Ron, and he's in bed dead, and I have a knife in my hand. She said, I don't remember what happened, but I know I must have killed him.
Investigators attempt to verify Catherine's claims, but there are no records of any domestic violence calls.
It seemed like they had several moments of acrimony, that they really, really, really didn't like each other from time to time, but I didn't see any hint whatsoever of physical violence.
Victims of domestic abuse generally do a pretty good job of concealing their bruises. Wear long sleeve shirts or makeup.
Investigators are working to corroborate Catherine's allegations when a pivotal witness comes forward, the captain of one of Ron's boats.
They were out again out on the water somewhere, and there was an argument, and he says that Ron became so angry at it, and he just simply pushed her either to get her away.
Aaron Brown, he had been with them for a while, and he said he had witnessed a great deal of physical abuse. He's one of the few people that actually saw it in real time. Ron also was pointing a gun at her and at Aaron Brown on another occasion.
But that night, that Mr. Vinci had been killed. Two people were there, my victim and my suspect, and no one else knew what the story was.
investigators still have to figure out one more piece of the puzzle.
How did she do this alone? Maybe she just pulled him and dragged him. Well, that would have certainly took an effort. But then to get him on the bed, was she physically able to do that? Not to me, she wasn't. You know, somebody had to help her.
To investigators, one man seems to be a perfect fit.
This is the point we're starting to suspect that Spencer Gordon may have some involvement in it. His actions, his demeanor, just at times really confuse us. I didn't see what I wanted to see in saying that he's going to say, oh my God, my friend, he's dead. You know, I loved him. He treated me well. We didn't get that from him. So we started talking to friends and say, hey, what's this relationship between Spencer and Mr. Vinci? According to Mr. Gonzalez, he was a leech.
Quite often, people with a lot of money have hangers-on, and that was Spencer Gordon. He liked to hang around for the free lunch. He got to go on Ron's boats and fly his flying machines and those kinds of things.
Was he trying to help her because he liked her, or was it something else? Was his mind on the business end of it? Oh God, I'm losing my bankroll here.
However, detectives are unable to confirm their suspicions.
I could not prove that Mr. Spencer was involved in it and that he had a hand in it, or was an accessory after the fact.
After reaching a dead end with Spencer, investigators turn their focus to their main suspect. Worried that sympathy for Catherine's emotional story will overshadow the evidence at trial, prosecutors consider other options.
I went to see our state attorney for approval to potentially seek a plea, in this case, to resolve it that way. He said, let a jury of her peers decide. Bring this to the people of Broward County in a jury trial. And that's what we did.
In November 2014, Catherine Pileggi's murder trial begins. Despite her claims of domestic abuse, prosecutors believe they have a solid case against her.
It's not a self-defense case because she chose to do what she did. To shoot him, to bludgeon him, all while he lay conscious or semi-conscious on a bed, when all she had to do was call the police.
But Catherine's lawyer presents expert testimony arguing Catherine believed she had no other option.
I'm a clinical and a forensic psychologist. I interviewed Miss Pileggi, who at that time was incarcerated. There was no question in my mind after doing the evaluation that Catherine Pileggi was a battered woman in her relationship with Ron, that she had developed battered woman syndrome and post-traumatic stress disorder, and that at the time of the incident when she shot and killed him, she definitely was impacted by all of that trauma, that she believed that she was in danger, that he could no longer control himself, and that he would kill her. And that's what prompted her to actually take his life.
I did my best to convince the jury that Kathy sincerely believed that. It's one of the few times I've ever put my client on the witness stand, but I felt I had no choice.
She took the stand and it was sad. She just didn't look like somebody who could possibly do this. And if she wasn't telling you that she did it, you'd never believe her.
When testimony ends, the judge instructs the jury not to consider a conviction for first-degree murder.
It went to the jury as either a murder to a manslaughter or not guilty. And I not only think, I know that decision was lawfully and rightfully and morally correct.
A prosecutor who goes for a first-degree murder conviction and doesn't get it is going to be upset about it. This one didn't get it and was satisfied with that outcome. That alone tells you that this case is highly unusual.
After 2 days, the jury returns with a verdict.
She was found guilty of second-degree murder. And ultimately, the judge indicated that although he didn't want to impose a sentence of 25 years, he felt he had to because the case involved use of a firearm, which under the law calls for a mandatory minimum sentence of 25 years.
Ultimately, the self-defense was not believed by this jury. I would say that this was one of the more nuanced cases that I've ever covered because you had a suspect, a defendant, who fit the role of victim in a lot of different ways. And you definitely feel compassion for her.
I can't help but wonder whether she's been punished enough, given that she had no criminal history in this one moment when she snapped, literally snapped, and had this out-of-body experience. No matter how you look at it, it's a troubling case.
There are other details that still nag at the minds of investigators.
When we went to the grand jury, one of the grand juries actually asked us, why haven't we arrested Mr. Gordon? And I had that same question. Well, we haven't arrested Mr. Gordon because we don't have the evidence to show that he was involved. But how did this frail woman, do what she did? It will always stick with me.
As far as Ron is concerned, I really enjoyed his company. I enjoyed his friendship. I never had a dislike for Kathy. I liked her. I never expected any of this, so it was a complete shock to me. It was hard for anybody to get their mind around how it happened. Sad story.
The sound comes first, always the sound. A hollow slam that cuts through the stillness like something out of place. A screen door snapping shut too hard for an ordinary night. Too sharp for a quiet suburban street where nothing ever really breaks the rhythm. And then, nothing. No footsteps trailing off. No laughter. No voice calling back into the house. Just a silence that settles too quickly, too completely, like the air itself has swallowed whatever came next. It is late June, 2003, the kind of California evening that feels almost staged in its calm. Warm air drifting through open windows, televisions murmuring in the background of neighboring homes. Sprinklers ticking across trimmed lawns. Everything predictable, everything safe. The illusion of control hanging over the neighborhood like a promise no one thinks to question. Not until that promise quietly collapses. Inside the house, a glass of soda sits on the kitchen counter, condensation still forming, a fingerprint smeared along its side, half-finished, abandoned mid-evening, the kind of small detail that would mean nothing on any other night but now becomes a fixed point, something investigators will return to again and again, trying to measure time, trying to reconstruct a moment that no longer exists except through fragments. Her name spreads in whispers at first, carried between phones, passed from one voice to another, uncertain, hesitant. Have you heard? She hasn't come back. They can't find her. The words stacking, gaining weight, until they become something heavier, something official, something that moves beyond private concern into public fear, and suddenly it's everywhere. On local radio, on television, printed in bold across early morning headlines, missing teen, last seen, mysterious disappearance, phrases that hit hard because they don't belong here, not in a place like this. 15 years old, last seen leaving her home just after sunset, no known reason to run, no history of conflict, no signs of distress, just gone. And that absence becomes the center of everything, a void that pulls in attention, speculation, suspicion. Because people need a reason, they need a cause, something they can point to and say, this is why, this is how, this is what happened, but there is nothing clear, nothing solid, only questions multiplying faster than answers can catch up. The police arrive quickly, patrol cars lining the curb, lights flashing in slow pulses that wash the street in alternating colors, officers moving with quiet urgency, not panic, but something close to it, because they know what this could mean. They know how cases like this begin and, more importantly, how they often end, and already there's a tension beneath the surface, an awareness that time is slipping, that every minute matters, that whatever happened may still be unfolding somewhere out of sight. They start with the obvious: the house, the yard, the immediate surroundings, checking doors, windows, fences, looking for signs of forced entry, disturbance, anything that suggests a struggle, but the scene refuses to cooperate. Everything is in place, nothing broken, nothing overturned, just that single detail, the door, the way it slammed, the way it didn't close gently, and even that is ambiguous, a clue that could mean everything or nothing at all. Neighbors gather at the edges of the scene, drawn by flashing lights and quiet commotion, their conversations low, cautious, each person offering what little they know, what little they think they saw, fragments that investigators collect carefully, writing them down, comparing them, looking for overlap, for consistency, but the accounts don't align cleanly. One person mentions a car parked down the street earlier than usual. Another recalls seeing movement near the side of the house, a shadow maybe, or just the trick of fading light. Someone else insists they heard footsteps running, but can't say when, can't say where. The details blur, overlap, contradict, and yet each one is recorded, preserved, because in cases like this, even the smallest inconsistency can matter. Even the faintest memory can become critical, and so everything is taken seriously, everything is considered, even as the bigger picture remains frustratingly out of reach. Search teams are organized before midnight, volunteers joining officers, moving in lines across nearby fields, through narrow paths, along the edges of wooded areas that border the neighborhood. Flashlights cutting through darkness, voices calling her name again and again, the sound echoing into the distance, unanswered, each call fading into silence that feels heavier with every passing hour. Dogs are brought in at first light, trained, focused, their movements precise as they pick up a scent from the house, follow it across the yard, down the street, past driveways and sidewalks, their handlers watching closely, tension building with every step, until suddenly, abruptly, the trail stops near the edge of the road, not gradually fading, not weakening, but stopping, as if something interrupted it completely, as if whatever happened removed her from that path in an instant. That moment becomes central, marked, photographed, documented, the place where presence turns into absence, where the last trace dissolves, and investigators return to it repeatedly, trying to understand what could cause such a break, what scenario fits that pattern. What kind of event leaves no continuation, no extension, just a clean end? Theories begin to form, cautiously at first, then more openly as the hours stretch into days. An abduction, possibly a vehicle involved, maybe the car mentioned by the neighbor, but there's no license plate, no clear description, just a vague memory of something out of place, something that didn't belong, and that vagueness becomes a problem because it offers direction but no certainty. The family steps into the spotlight reluctantly, drawn there by necessity, standing before cameras, faces pale, voices controlled but strained, repeating the same plea, again and again, asking for help, asking for information, asking anyone who saw anything to come forward, their words carrying a mix of hope and fear that resonates far beyond the immediate community, because people recognize it, they understand what it means to not know, to be suspended in uncertainty. Tips begin to come in, dozens, then hundreds, each one logged, investigated, followed up, most leading nowhere, some raising brief moments of possibility before collapsing under scrutiny. False sightings, mistaken identities, details that almost fit but ultimately don't, and with each dead end, the case grows heavier, more complex, more resistant to resolution. Time moves forward, but the investigation seems to circle, revisiting the same points, re-examining the same evidence, trying to find something that was missed. Something overlooked because the absence of a clear narrative is itself a problem, a gap that demands to be filled, and yet remains stubbornly empty. Days become weeks, weeks become months, and the language begins to shift, subtly at first, from urgency to persistence, from immediate action to ongoing effort, and eventually to something quieter, something more distant. The phrase no one wants to hear but everyone knows is coming, cold case, a term that carries finality even when it isn't meant to, a label that suggests the trail has gone cold, that the answers have slipped beyond reach. But even then, the file doesn't close. It remains active in a different way, stored, revisited, kept alive by the possibility that something, someday, might change, that a new piece of information might surface, that a detail might be seen differently, that the silence might finally break. Because cases like this don't disappear, they linger, in records, in memories, in the quiet spaces between what is known and what is not, waiting, always waiting for the moment when something shifts, when the past refuses to stay buried any longer. And somewhere in that waiting, in that long stretch of unanswered time, the truth remains, hidden, intact, untouched, holding its place in the darkness, just beyond reach. By the second week, the noise begins to change, not louder, not quieter, but different, sharper at the edges, less hopeful, more urgent, the kind of urgency that creeps in when people start to realize this is no longer a matter of hours or even days. This is something else entirely, something that resists the natural order of search and rescue, something that refuses to resolve itself in the way everyone expected. Flyers blanket the neighborhood, stapled to poles, taped to storefront windows, handed out at intersections where cars slow just long enough for drivers to glance, to read, to feel that quick jolt of unease before moving on. The same image repeated over and over, a smiling face frozen in time, a face that now carries a weight it was never meant to hold, because it no longer represents a moment, it represents an absence. Volunteers keep coming, more than anyone anticipated, people from neighboring towns, strangers who have only seen her face on television but feel compelled to help, to walk the same ground again and again, retracing steps that have already been traced, searching areas that have already been searched because no one wants to be the one who missed something, no one wants to accept that the answer might not be out there in plain sight. Investigators expand outward, methodical, disciplined, mapping every location, every lead, every possibility, building timelines that stretch across hours, then days, then weeks, trying to account for every movement, every gap, every unexplained moment, but the timeline refuses to solidify, it bends, it breaks, it leaves spaces that cannot be filled with certainty. The car becomes a fixation, that vague, half-remembered detail offered by a neighbor who now replays the memory constantly, trying to sharpen it, to pull clarity from something that may never have been clear to begin with, a dark shape, maybe a sedan, maybe older, maybe parked, maybe idling, the kind of description that feels important but lacks the precision needed to act on it decisively. Police canvass the area repeatedly, knocking on doors, asking the same questions in different ways, hoping for a shift, hoping that someone might remember something differently the second or third or fourth time. But the answers remain frustratingly consistent in their inconsistency, each account just slightly off from the next, each detail just uncertain enough to weaken its value. Then comes the first break, or at least what feels like one. A witness from outside the immediate neighborhood reports seeing a young girl walking along a road several blocks away around the same time, alone, moving quickly, head down. The description close enough to matter, close enough to trigger a surge of activity. Patrol units dispatched, the area searched again with renewed intensity, but nothing is found, no confirmation, no trace, just another possibility that lingers without resolution. The media begins to circle more aggressively, satellite trucks lining the streets, reporters speaking into cameras with carefully measured tones, balancing sensitivity with the undeniable pull of a story that has captured attention far beyond the local community. Words like mysterious disappearance and possible abduction, repeated in loops that both inform and unsettle, each broadcast drawing more eyes, more speculation, more pressure. Tips increase, exponentially now, phone lines flooded, emails pouring in, each one carrying the weight of potential, each one demanding to be checked, verified, investigated. And so the process expands, more personnel assigned, more resources committed, the case growing larger, more complex, more difficult to contain within a single narrative. Among the tips are names, individuals who might have seen something, might have been nearby, might have reason to know more than they are saying, and those names begin to form a secondary layer of the investigation. Interviews conducted in quiet rooms, questions asked with precision, answers recorded, analyzed, compared, looking for cracks, for hesitation, for anything that suggests a deviation from truth. Most of those interviews lead nowhere. Alibis confirmed, timelines supported, suspicions dissolving under scrutiny, but not all of them. Some linger. Some leave behind a residue of doubt. Not enough to act on immediately, but enough to keep them in the file, enough to mark them as something to revisit later. One name in particular surfaces more than once, not prominently, not dramatically, but repeatedly, appearing in different contexts, connected loosely to the area, to the timeline, to the edges of the case. Someone who had reason to be nearby, someone who had been seen before, someone who, when questioned, offered answers that seemed acceptable but not entirely satisfying. Investigators note it, flag it, but move on because at this stage, there are too many possibilities, too many directions to pursue, and nothing strong enough to justify focusing all attention on a single thread. And so the case continues to spread outward, widening its scope in the hope that something, somewhere, will finally solidify into a lead that can be followed with confidence. Weeks turn into months, and the energy begins to shift again, not fading, but changing shape, becoming more controlled, more procedural, the initial surge of activity. Settling into a sustained effort, the kind of work that requires patience, endurance, and the ability to keep moving forward even when progress feels minimal. Searches become less frequent but more targeted, based on analysis rather than instinct. Areas selected because they fit certain criteria, because they align with specific theories, because they represent possibilities that have not yet been fully explored. But even these focused efforts yield nothing definitive, nothing that can anchor the investigation in a clear direction. The family continues to speak, their voices carrying a different tone now, less immediate, more resolute, a determination that has replaced the initial shock, their message consistent, unwavering, refusing to let the case fade, refusing to let their daughter become just another file, just another statistic, just another story that people eventually stop following. Community events are organized, vigils held, candles lit in quiet gatherings that bring people together not just in support, but in shared uncertainty. Because the lack of answers affects everyone, it changes how they see their surroundings, how they move through their daily routines, how they trust the normal patterns of their lives. At night, the neighborhood feels different, quieter in a way that isn't peaceful, more watchful, more aware, doors locked more carefully, windows checked twice, the absence of one person altering the behavior of many, a ripple effect that extends far beyond the immediate loss. Investigators revisit the original scene repeatedly, walking the same ground, retracing the same steps, trying to see it differently, trying to imagine what might have been missed, because the simplicity of the disappearance continues to stand out, continues to challenge assumptions, continues to suggest that whatever happened was executed with a level of control that is both unusual and deeply unsettling. They reconstruct timelines again, minute by minute, aligning phone records, verifying movements, checking every possible interaction, every possible point of contact. But the same problem persists, a gap, a break, a moment where presence becomes absence without explanation, a transition that remains stubbornly unclear. The car returns to focus, again and again, that single vague detail refusing to fade, investigators broadening their approach, checking vehicle registrations across wider areas, comparing descriptions, looking for matches that might have been overlooked, but without a clear model, without a plate, without anything concrete. The search becomes a slow, exhaustive process with no guarantee of success. And still, that one name lingers, quietly, consistently, appearing in notes, in reports, in the margins of the investigation, never central, never dominant, but always there, like a shadow that doesn't quite disappear, a detail that refuses to be fully dismissed. At the time, it isn't enough, not enough to shift the direction of the case, not enough to justify a deeper focus, but it is recorded, preserved, stored along with everything else, waiting, like all the other fragments, for the moment when context might change, when new information might cast it in a different light. Because in investigations like this, nothing truly goes away. Every detail remains. Every note, every statement, every uncertainty, all held together in a growing body of information that may not make sense now, but might later, when the right piece falls into place. And so the case continues, moving forward while carrying the weight of everything that has come before it, expanding, evolving, but never resolving, the central question still hanging, still unanswered, still demanding a truth that remains just out of reach. The silence persists, but it is no longer empty. It is filled with fragments, with possibilities, with threads that stretch in every direction, waiting for the one that will finally lead somewhere real. And somewhere within those threads, buried beneath layers of time and uncertainty, the truth remains intact, unchanged, waiting for the moment when it can no longer stay hidden. By the third month, the case begins to harden, not into clarity, but into something more rigid, more difficult to move, like concrete setting around unanswered questions, locking them in place while investigators circle the same ground again and again, searching for cracks that refuse to appear, and yet the pressure does not ease. It builds, slowly, persistently, fueled by the knowledge that time is no longer an ally, but an obstacle. The rhythm of the investigation changes in subtle ways, less visible to the public, more internal, more analytical, teams breaking down every statement, every timeline, every fragment of evidence, reconstructing the night. Not as a sequence of events, but as a series of possibilities, each one mapped out, tested, challenged, discarded, or held onto with cautious uncertainty, because when nothing is certain, everything must be considered. The house becomes a focal point again, not for what it shows, but for what it doesn't, investigators walking through it in silence, visualizing movement, imagining paths, asking questions that no one can answer. How long was she inside before she left? Did she leave willingly? Did she step outside alone? Was she called? Was she followed? Each question branching into more questions, each scenario leading to another dead end. The glass on the counter remains logged, photographed, processed, a small, almost insignificant detail elevated by circumstance, examined for prints, for residue, for anything that might suggest interaction, interruption, but it yields nothing beyond what is already known. It confirms presence, nothing more, a static object in a case defined by absence. Investigators begin to shift their attention more deliberately toward human factors, relationships, interactions, the social environment surrounding the victim, friends, acquaintances, neighbors, anyone who might have had contact, however brief, however indirect, because in the absence of physical evidence, behavior becomes evidence, patterns become clues, and inconsistencies become signals. Interviews are conducted again, this time with sharper focus, questions revisited with new framing, small details emphasized, timelines tightened, because memory changes over time. It reshapes itself, fills in gaps, adjusts under pressure, and sometimes, within those adjustments, the truth reveals itself, not directly, but through contradiction. Some witnesses begin to shift their accounts, not dramatically, but enough to be noticed, times adjusted by minutes, descriptions refined or altered, details added that were not mentioned before. And while most of these changes can be attributed to the natural erosion of memory, a few stand out, subtle but persistent, raising quiet flags within the investigation. That same name surfaces again, this time in a slightly different context, connected not just to the area, but to a possible interaction earlier in the day. Nothing confirmed, nothing definitive, but enough to warrant another look, another interview, another attempt to clarify what may or may not have happened. The interview is calm, controlled, routine on the surface, but beneath it runs a current of scrutiny, investigators listening not just to the answers, but to the pauses, the tone, the rhythm of speech. Because sometimes what isn't said carries as much weight as what is, and in this case, there are moments, brief, almost imperceptible, where the answers feel rehearsed, where the certainty feels constructed rather than recalled. Still, it isn't enough, not yet. There is no direct evidence, no contradiction strong enough to justify escalation, and so the name is noted again, flagged more prominently this time, but still not central, still part of a broader field of possibilities that continues to expand rather than narrow. The car remains unresolved, but investigators begin to treat it less as a single detail and more as a variable, considering different models, different timeframes, different routes. Reconstructing traffic patterns, analyzing who might have been in the area, who might have had reason to pass through, broadening the scope in an attempt to compensate for the lack of specificity. Records are pulled, surveillance footage from nearby businesses examined frame by frame, grainy images scrutinized for anything that might resemble the described vehicle. But the quality is poor, the angles limited, and while a few cars match the general description, none can be definitively linked, each one another possibility that fades under closer inspection. The scent trail continues to be a point of focus, that abrupt ending near the road refusing to be explained away, investigators consulting experts, exploring scenarios that could account for such a clean break. A vehicle pickup, possibly, or a transfer of scent, but without additional evidence, these remain theories, plausible but unconfirmed, adding layers without providing resolution. Meanwhile, the public narrative begins to shift again. Interest remains high, but the tone becomes more speculative, more analytical. Media outlets revisiting the case with deeper dives, reconstructing timelines, highlighting unanswered questions, drawing in audiences who are both fascinated and unsettled by the lack of clarity, the idea that something so significant could leave so little behind. Online forums begin to form, early communities of discussion where individuals dissect every known detail, propose theories, challenge each other's assumptions. Creating a parallel investigation driven by curiosity and obsession, some ideas insightful, others wildly speculative, but all contributing to the growing mythos of the case. For the investigators, this external noise is both a resource and a distraction, tips sometimes emerging from these discussions, but also a flood of misinformation that must be filtered out, verified, managed, because in a case already burdened by uncertainty, false leads can be as damaging as the absence of leads. Internally, the case file grows, thick with reports, transcripts, analysis, every detail preserved, cataloged, cross-referenced, creating a complex web of information that reflects both the depth of the investigation and the difficulty of the problem, because despite all the work, despite all the effort, the central question remains unchanged. What happened that night? The answer feels close at times, almost within reach, suggested by patterns, hinted at by inconsistencies, but never fully revealed, always slipping away just as it begins to take shape, leaving behind a sense of frustration that builds slowly, steadily, beneath the surface of the investigation. The family continues to wait, their world defined now by the absence, by the uncertainty, by the endless repetition of hope and disappointment, each new lead bringing a moment of possibility, each dead end reinforcing the reality that the truth remains hidden. Seasons begin to change, the warm evenings of summer giving way to cooler nights, then to the quiet stillness of winter, and through it all, the case persists, unchanged in its core, but evolving in its complexity, absorbing time, memory, and effort without yielding the clarity everyone is searching for. Investigators rotate, some stepping away, others stepping in, fresh eyes reviewing old material, bringing new perspectives, new questions, sometimes noticing details that were overlooked, sometimes reinforcing conclusions already reached, but always adding to the ongoing process of trying to make sense of something that resists explanation. And still, that one name remains, no longer just a note in the margin, but not yet the center of attention, existing in that uncertain space between possibility and suspicion, a thread that has not been pulled hard enough to reveal what lies beneath it. Because at this stage, the investigation is still searching, still exploring, still trying to find the direction that will lead somewhere definitive, and until that direction becomes clear, every possibility remains open, every theory remains viable, and every detail remains significant. The silence that followed the slam of that door has not lifted. It has only deepened, filled now with layers of analysis, speculation, and unanswered questions, a silence that is no longer empty, but heavy, dense with everything that has been considered and everything that has yet to be understood. And somewhere within that density, within that accumulation of time and effort, the truth remains unchanged, waiting, as it always has, for the moment when the right question is finally asked in the right way. By the time the 4th month arrives, the case no longer feels like a search. It feels like a slow descent into the mechanics of absence, where every new layer uncovered only reinforces how little is actually known. And investigators begin to understand that what they are dealing with is not simply a missing person, but a disappearance constructed with unsettling precision, as if every trace was considered before it vanished. The first real shift comes from something almost ordinary, a stack of old phone records pulled from storage, documents that had once been reviewed quickly in the early chaos of the investigation. Then set aside when nothing immediately stood out, because in 2003 the tools were limited, the connections harder to see, and the urgency had always been focused on physical search rather than digital reconstruction. Now, years later, those same records are being re-examined with a different mindset, slower, more analytical, cross-referenced against updated timelines, and what emerges is not a dramatic revelation, but a pattern so subtle it could have easily been ignored. Brief outbound calls, short durations, placed in the hours leading up to the disappearance, not unusual on their own, but unusual in timing, clustered in a way that suggests attention rather than coincidence. Investigators begin mapping those calls geographically, reconstructing signal coverage from the era, triangulating rough locations, not to pinpoint exact positions, but to narrow down zones of activity. And slowly a picture begins to form that places certain communications closer to specific areas than previously assumed, tightening the geography of the final known hours. At the same time, interviews that were once considered closed are reopened, not aggressively, but carefully, as if the passage of time itself might loosen something that was previously withheld. And in these second-round conversations, subtle changes begin to appear, not in outright contradictions, but in emphasis, in hesitation, in the way certain moments are described with slightly more distance than before. One witness in particular revises their timeline by minutes, then insists it is insignificant, a simple mistake, but in a case defined by absence, even minutes carry weight. And those minutes begin to matter when layered against phone activity, against the last confirmed sighting, against the scent trail that ended so abruptly near the road. The car, once a vague silhouette in memory, returns again, but this time under sharper scrutiny, investigators pulling traffic patterns from nearby intersections, examining any available surveillance footage that still exists on deteriorating tapes, watching grainy frames over and over, slowing them down, enhancing them, trying to extract clarity from images that were never designed to preserve detail. And then something unexpected appears, not a clear match, not a definitive identification, but a moment in footage where a vehicle passes through the edge of the frame at the approximate time window, its shape consistent with earlier descriptions, its presence too aligned with reconstructed timelines to be dismissed immediately, and for the first time in years, the investigation feels like it is touching something real rather than theoretical. That footage becomes a focal point, analyzed frame by frame, discussed in late-night sessions among investigators who have spent years with a case, their tone changing slightly, not yet excitement, but a cautious alertness, the kind that comes when something long dormant begins to move again. Parallel to this, the name that has lingered in the margins begins to appear more frequently in internal discussions, not as an accusation, but as a point of convergence, someone whose presence overlaps too neatly with multiple threads, someone who had been interviewed early, released, and then gradually faded into the background of the investigation as attention shifted elsewhere. Re-interviewing this individual becomes a delicate process, structured, calm, designed not to provoke, but to clarify, yet from the beginning there is a noticeable difference in tone. Compared to earlier interactions, a certain stiffness in responses, a careful selection of words that stands out to trained ears accustomed to thousands of interviews over years of work. Questions are repeated, not aggressively, but with slight variations, probing consistency, testing memory, and while most answers remain steady, there are moments where details blur, where timelines hesitate, where certainty gives way to approximation. And in a case like this, approximation is never neutral, it always raises questions. Investigators do not have enough for confrontation, not enough for formal escalation, but they now have enough to justify deeper surveillance of data, financial records, communication patterns, anything that might reveal movement or intent that was previously hidden in plain sight. At the same time, forensic re-examination of evidence begins, not because new evidence has appeared, but because new methods have, and samples that were once limited in their usefulness are now subjected to more advanced analysis, revealing traces that could not be detected at the time, microscopic indicators that suggest contact with environments or surfaces previously unconsidered. None of it is conclusive on its own, but collectively it begins to shift the balance of probability, nudging the case away from randomness and toward structure, away from unknown forces and toward human involvement that is more deliberate than originally assumed. The community, unaware of these internal developments, continues to live in the shadow of the case, but something has changed in tone, even in public perception, as rumors begin to circulate. That the investigation is active again, that new evidence has emerged, though no official statement confirms anything substantial, and silence from authorities only deepens speculation. Online discussion intensifies, theories multiply, but now there is a noticeable shift even there as older threads are revived, details reanalyzed with renewed seriousness, timelines reconstructed with greater precision, and among the noise, certain names and patterns begin to surface repeatedly, echoing the same internal focus developing within the investigation itself. Meanwhile, the family is brought in for updated briefings, their expectations carefully managed, because investigators understand the danger of raising hope prematurely. But they also understand the responsibility of transparency when real movement is occurring, even if it is still fragile, still incomplete. In those meetings, nothing is confirmed, nothing is concluded, but there is a change in energy that is impossible to ignore, a sense that the case is no longer static, that it has entered a phase where answers might finally be approaching, even if they remain just out of reach. Yet the most unsettling aspect of this phase is not what is found, but what is not, because even as evidence accumulates, even as patterns tighten, there remains a core gap. A moment that still cannot be explained with certainty, the exact transition from presence to absence, the precise mechanism of disappearance, still locked behind layers of ambiguity. Investigators begin to articulate a new working theory, not publicly but internally, suggesting that the disappearance was not opportunistic but structured, involving planning, timing, and knowledge of environment, a scenario that implies familiarity, or at least preparation, and that realization narrows the field of possibilities in a way that feels both helpful and deeply unsettling. Because narrowing a field does not mean solving it, it simply means focusing the unknown into a more concentrated form, and the pressure of that concentration is now being felt across the entire investigation. Every piece of evidence, every interview, every reconstructed timeline is now being reevaluated through this new lens, and in doing so, old assumptions begin to collapse, replaced by interpretations that are more complex, more interconnected, and more difficult to ignore. Still, there is no arrest, no confirmation, no final clarity, only movement, subtle and persistent, like something shifting beneath the surface of a long, still lake, suggesting depth that has always been there but never fully visible. And as the investigation edges closer to something that feels like truth without yet reaching it, one reality becomes impossible to avoid, that the silence surrounding that night in 2003 was never empty. It was constructed layer by layer, and whatever lies beneath it has been waiting all this time for the moment when it can no longer remain hidden. By the time the investigation enters its fifth phase, the silence around the case is no longer passive. It feels watched, measured, as if something somewhere, is aware of every new step being taken, adjusting itself just beyond reach, staying one move ahead of certainty. Investigators do not say this aloud, of course. They never do. But in the long hours of review rooms and dim offices filled with case files, there is a growing sense that this disappearance was never static. It adapted. It survived scrutiny. It learned how to remain unseen. The renewed surveillance begins quietly, almost bureaucratically, framed as routine follow-up rather than escalation. But behind closed doors, the tone is different. Certain individuals who were once peripheral to the case are now placed under closer observation, not because there is proof, but because there is pattern recognition, and in long investigations like this, patterns often speak before evidence does. Movements are tracked in retrospect first, then in real time where legally permitted. Habits are mapped. Routines are reconstructed from fragments of old records and new observations. What emerges is not a single line of suspicion, but a web of intersections. One individual's movements overlap too precisely with key time windows. Another's communications show irregular gaps that coincide with investigative milestones. None of it forms a direct accusation. But together, it creates something harder to ignore than suspicion alone. It creates focus. Inside the department, the case begins to split into two parallel realities. In one, the official version remains cautious, restrained, bound by procedure. In the other, a more aggressive internal working theory takes shape, one that suggests coordination rather than chaos, intention rather than randomness. The idea is not yet spoken publicly, but it begins to influence everything. The questions asked, the evidence revisited, the tone of interviews. And it is in those interviews that the first real tension returns. The re-interviews are no longer routine. They are layered, structured with precision. Questions are no longer about memory alone, but about consistency across time. Investigators return to earlier statements, not as reference points, but as pressure points. Small inconsistencies are no longer dismissed as human error. They are stacked, compared, examined for meaning. In one of these sessions, a witness who once appeared confident begins to fracture slightly under repetition. Not dramatically, not in a way that would justify immediate action, but enough to register. A pause that lasts a second too long. A correction that feels rehearsed rather than recalled. A shift in posture when a specific time window is mentioned. None of it is proof, but it is deviation. And deviation is where investigations begin to change direction. Outside the interview rooms, forensic teams continue to reprocess evidence that had long been considered exhausted. Advances in analytical techniques open new categories of detection, revealing traces that were invisible in 2003. Microscopic residues, environmental markers, patterns within what once looked like noise. Each discovery is small on its own, almost negligible. But together, they begin to form a texture of presence that contradicts earlier assumptions of randomness. The most unsettling aspect is not what is found, but where it is found. Connections begin to emerge between items that were previously treated as unrelated. Objects once cataloged separately now show overlapping indicators. It suggests contact. Not incidental, but repeated. Not distant, but close enough to matter. As this internal reconstruction deepens, the investigation quietly narrows. Not officially, but functionally. Resources are concentrated. Attention shifts inward toward a smaller group of individuals whose timelines, communications, and past interactions align too consistently with the reconstructed sequence of events. It is not yet a suspect list. It is something more fragile, a convergence list. And within that convergence, one name begins to rise with increasing frequency. Still not central, still not confirmed, but impossible to ignore. The return to that name is not sudden. It is gradual, almost reluctant. It begins in footnotes of reports, then appears in margins of timeline charts, then surfaces during internal discussions where someone, cautiously, asks whether earlier interpretations were too dismissive. The name carries no formal weight yet, but it carries repetition. And repetition, in investigative work, is rarely meaningless. A decision is made to review every prior interaction with this individual from the beginning. Not just transcripts, but behavioral notes, timing of responses, inconsistencies in scheduling, proximity to key locations. What was once scattered data becomes a single continuous thread. And when viewed this way, the thread does not prove guilt, but it does not dissolve either. It holds. Meanwhile, digital reconstruction of the final known hours becomes more refined. Old cell tower data is reinterpreted with modern mapping tools, allowing investigators to simulate movement patterns with greater precision than was ever possible in 2003. The result is unsettling. Certain overlaps become too aligned to dismiss as coincidence. Multiple data points converge within narrow windows that correspond to the disappearance timeline. At this stage, the investigation begins to feel less like discovery and more like compression. Everything is being pulled toward a central point that has not yet revealed itself. Then comes the second shift. A previously archived piece of material, overlooked during earlier phases due to its lack of immediate relevance, is re-examined during a routine audit of old case files. It is not new evidence. It is old context viewed under new conditions. And in that shift of perspective, something changes. A detail that once seemed irrelevant now aligns too neatly with reconstructed timelines. A reference that was dismissed as incidental begins to echo across other findings. The effect is immediate inside the investigative team. Not excitement, not certainty, something more restrained. Recognition that the case may have contained its own answer from the beginning, but lacked the structure needed to interpret it. From this point, interviews intensify again, but with a different tone. Less exploratory, more directional. Questions are no longer broad. They are narrowed to specific intersections of time, place, and behavior. Investigators are no longer searching for what happened. They are testing what version of events can survive consistency checks. And under that pressure, small cracks begin to appear. Not confessions, not revelations, but inconsistencies that accumulate faster than they can be explained away. A timeline that shifts by minutes becomes a timeline that shifts by more than it should. A casual encounter described as brief becomes less certain in duration. A movement pattern that once seemed ordinary begins to lose coherence when placed against external data. Every shift alone is minor. Together, they form something harder to ignore. Yet even now, the case refuses to resolve, because every new alignment introduces new uncertainty elsewhere. Every narrowing creates another gap. The investigation is beginning to resemble a structure that holds only because too many parts are still unknown. Outside the investigative unit, the public perception begins to stir again. Subtle leaks of renewed activity circulate through local media. Nothing confirmed, nothing official, but enough to reignite attention. The case that once faded into the background of community memory begins to re-enter conversation, not as history, but as something unfinished. For the family, the shift is immediate. Meetings become more frequent, more structured, more cautious in tone. There is movement, but it is still undefined. Progress, but not resolution. Hope, but not certainty. Investigators avoid definitive language because they have learned too well how fragile momentum can be in cases like this. And still, beneath all of it, the central absence remains untouched. The exact moment of disappearance is still not fully reconstructed. The final transition from presence to absence remains the most protected space in the timeline, resistant to every attempt to define it cleanly. It is here that the investigation continues to circle, returning again and again, as if the answer exists just beyond the edge of comprehension. What has changed is not the truth itself, but the distance to it. It feels closer now, compressed, contained within fewer variables, fewer possibilities. But closer does not mean reached. And in this case, closeness may be the most dangerous phase of all, because it creates the illusion that resolution is inevitable when, in reality, it is still unconfirmed. And somewhere within this tightening structure of data, memory, and contradiction, the disappearance of 2003 continues to hold its final secret, waiting for the moment when the investigation is no longer circling it, but standing directly in front of it, unable to look away. By the sixth phase of the investigation, something fundamental has changed in the atmosphere surrounding the case. It is no longer defined by search efforts or missing person urgency. It has become something heavier, more contained, as if the investigation itself has begun to fold inward, tightening around a core set of facts that refuse to fully reveal their meaning. Every new development feels less like discovery and more like convergence. The internal focus sharpens. Investigators are no longer exploring wide possibilities. They are working inside narrowed corridors of probability, where each detail is measured not by what it could mean in isolation, but by how it interacts with everything else. The case file, once sprawling with theories and scattered leads, is now being reorganized into structured timelines, cross-linked datasets, and behavioral maps. And within that structure, the same recurring inconsistencies begin to stand out more clearly. Not dramatic contradictions, not outright falsehoods, but patterns that fail to align cleanly when stacked together. A conversation that cannot be precisely placed in time. A movement that overlaps too neatly with multiple key windows. A witness recollection that shifts slightly depending on how the question is framed. Individually, they remain explainable. Collectively, they begin to form pressure points. At the center of this tightening framework, investigators return once again to the reconstructed final hours of the victim. Every known detail is now reanalyzed with new computational tools, allowing the team to simulate movement paths, estimate timing margins, and test scenarios that were previously too complex to model. What emerges is not a definitive sequence, but a narrowing range of possibility that is far smaller than what was originally believed. The disappearance window, once estimated in broad terms, is now reduced significantly. Minutes matter more than hours. Transitions matter more than general behavior. The entire case begins to hinge on a short, critical span of time that refuses to clarify itself fully, no matter how many times it is reconstructed. And in that narrowed window, the presence of certain external data points becomes increasingly significant. Cellular reconstruction, once considered unreliable due to technological limitations in 2003, is now revisited using modern calibration methods. Signal behavior is simulated under different environmental conditions. Coverage maps are corrected. Margins of error are redefined. The result does not produce certainty, but it does produce alignment. Certain movements, once considered too vague to matter, now cluster within a tighter geographic zone than previously assumed. That zone becomes a focal point. Investigators begin re-interviewing individuals connected to that area with renewed precision. The questioning is no longer exploratory. It is structured around confirmed overlaps. Where were you at this exact time? Who else was present? What routes were taken? What was observed, and more importantly, what was not observed? The tone of these interviews changes the dynamic immediately. Some witnesses respond with calm consistency, reinforcing earlier statements. Others begin to adjust details subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably as questions become more specific. It is not panic. It is pressure. And pressure, in long-stalled investigations, often reveals structure beneath memory. One particular individual once considered peripheral to the case is now examined more intensively than before. Not because of a single incriminating fact, but because of alignment. Their timeline overlaps too precisely with reconstructed windows. Their known movements intersect with key geographic points. Their communications during the critical period contain irregular gaps that cannot be immediately explained by routine behavior. This does not constitute suspicion in a legal sense, but in investigative practice, alignment often precedes understanding. Parallel to this, forensic reevaluation continues to yield subtle but persistent results. Environmental traces, once dismissed due to lack of context, now appear in patterns that suggest repeated contact with specific locations or surfaces. Nothing definitive can be drawn from any single sample, but the aggregation of microevidence begins to form a consistent directionality that was not visible in earlier stages of analysis. It suggests presence, not accidental, not random, but situational. And situational presence, in a disappearance case, carries weight. As these threads converge internally, external attention begins to stir again. The case, long dormant in public consciousness, reemerges in fragmented form through local reports and online discussions. No official announcement is made, but there is enough activity, renewed interviews, revisited evidence, increased investigative presence, for speculation to ignite once more. The narrative that forms outside the investigation is incomplete, but not inaccurate. People sense movement. They sense that something previously unresolved is being approached again, though they cannot yet see how or where it will lead. Inside the investigation, however, caution remains dominant. Despite the tightening of patterns, there is still no single piece of evidence strong enough to define causation. Everything is still interpretive. Everything still requires confirmation. And in cases built on time gaps and absence, interpretation can shift rapidly under new scrutiny. Still, a quiet shift begins to occur among the investigative team. The language used in internal discussions becomes more directional. Instead of asking what might have happened, they begin asking how a specific scenario could have occurred without leaving clearer traces. Instead of exploring possibilities, they begin testing constraints. This subtle shift marks an important stage in long investigations, the transition from open inquiry to structured hypothesis testing. And within that structure, one hypothesis begins to gain cautious attention, not because it is confirmed, but because it fits too many overlapping conditions to ignore. It suggests a scenario involving controlled timing, environmental familiarity, and deliberate minimization of traceable evidence. It is not presented as conclusion. It is presented as framework. A framework that explains certain patterns more efficiently than earlier theories. Yet even as this framework strengthens, the central problem remains unchanged. The exact mechanism of disappearance is still not directly observable in the data. There is still a missing step, a gap in continuity that no reconstruction fully resolves. This missing step is not small. It is the core of the case. Investigators refer to it informally as the transition point, the moment where presence becomes absence. Everything before it is increasingly understood. Everything after it is documented. But the transition itself remains obscured. Efforts to reconstruct it intensify. Timelines are compressed further. Environmental simulations are refined. Behavioral sequences are rechecked under stricter assumptions. Each iteration removes noise, but does not reveal the missing link. Instead, it sharpens the edges of uncertainty, making the gap more visible but not easier to cross. And as this gap becomes more defined, the emotional weight of the case begins to resurface among those closest to it. Not publicly, but internally. Investigators who have worked the file for years begin to recognize a familiar pattern, the feeling of nearing something without reaching it, of accumulation without closure. The family remains in periodic contact, receiving carefully measured updates. Each meeting carries the same dual tension. Progress exists, but resolution does not. Hope is sustained but controlled. No promises are made because promises in cases like this have historically collapsed under the weight of missing information. Still, something has undeniably shifted. The case is no longer static. It is moving again, but in a confined space, like pressure building inside a sealed system. Every new piece of data reduces randomness, but increases intensity. Every clarified detail narrows the field, but deepens the central unknown. And somewhere within that narrowing field lies the final unresolved moment of 2003, still intact, still unaccounted for, still resisting full reconstruction. At this stage, investigators understand something critical. They are no longer searching broadly. They are approaching a point where one piece of confirmation, just one, could transform everything already gathered into a coherent narrative. But until that moment arrives, the case remains suspended between structure and silence, defined not by what is unknown in general, but by one specific absence that refuses to resolve itself. And in that absence, The truth remains unchanged, waiting within reach, but still just beyond the final step needed to bring it into view. By the 7th phase of the investigation, the case no longer behaves like a mystery spread across time. It behaves like a structure under stress. Every layer of data, every reconstructed timeline, every revisited statement is now pulling toward a central point that still refuses to fully reveal itself. Investigators no longer describe the case in terms of search or inquiry. They describe it in terms of pressure, alignment, and constraint. The first major development comes not from a witness, but from a refinement of old data. Archived surveillance footage, once considered unusable due to poor resolution and limited framing, is processed again using modern enhancement techniques. The goal is not to create clarity where none exists, but to extract structure from noise. Frame by frame, motion is stabilized. Shadows are reinterpreted. Vehicle outlines are compared against updated models. What emerges is not certainty, but consistency. A specific movement pattern appears across multiple frames from different locations within a narrow time window. The timing aligns too closely with the reconstructed disappearance window to be dismissed. The vehicle remains indistinct, but its behavior is no longer random. It follows a path that suggests intent rather than coincidence. This discovery does not solve anything, but it changes how the timeline is understood. It introduces continuity where there was once fragmentation. Inside the investigative unit, the atmosphere shifts again. Meetings become more frequent, more focused. Discussions are no longer exploratory. They are evaluative. Each piece of evidence is now measured against the emerging framework rather than against general possibility. The question is no longer what could have happened. The question is what explanation can survive without contradiction. At the center of this tightening structure, the previously established convergence zone is redefined with greater precision. Mapping specialists refine geographic boundaries using updated signal reconstructions, traffic flow analysis, and environmental modeling. The result is a smaller, more concentrated area of interest. A zone that contains too many overlapping variables to be ignored, yet too few definitive markers to resolve easily. Within this zone, investigators return again to individuals whose movements intersect multiple reconstructed points. The scrutiny is no longer equal. It is weighted. Certain timelines now carry more significance than others based on their alignment with the evolving model. One individual in particular becomes increasingly central to internal discussions, not through new evidence, but through accumulation. Their presence appears in multiple reconstructed intersections. Their known movements fit within critical time margins. Their earlier statements, once considered consistent, now contain subtle gaps when reanalyzed under stricter sequencing. These gaps are not dramatic. They are structural. Small inconsistencies in duration, sequence, and proximity that do not align cleanly when placed under computational reconstruction. Re-interviews are conducted again, but this time under tighter procedural conditions. Questions are not broad. They are anchored to specific timestamps. Investigators present reconstructed sequences and ask for confirmation or correction. The goal is no longer memory retrieval. It is validation of coherence. Under this pressure, responses begin to show variation, not in substance at first, but in structure. Certain events are described with slightly altered ordering. Certain interactions are recalled with shifting emphasis. When confronted with precise timestamps, hesitation becomes more visible. These are not confessions. They are inconsistencies that resist easy explanation. Elsewhere, forensic analysis reaches another incremental breakthrough. Microscopic trace evidence recovered from previously examined items is reinterpreted using updated comparative databases. This does not produce direct identification, but it does establish environmental linkage patterns that suggest repeated exposure to specific conditions. In practical terms, it indicates that certain objects or surfaces connected to the case were likely present in more than one relevant location during the critical time frame. This does not confirm interaction, but it confirms movement of material context across space, something that significantly narrows theoretical possibilities. As these findings accumulate, the internal model of the case begins to stabilize around a narrower hypothesis space. Investigators are no longer considering dozens of scenarios. They are focusing on a small number of structurally consistent explanations. Each of these explanations shares common characteristics: controlled timing, limited trace generation, and spatial familiarity. This narrowing is both progress and constraint. It reduces randomness, but increases pressure on remaining unknowns. At the same time, digital reconstruction of communication patterns from 2003 is revisited again with improved metadata interpretation techniques. While content is unavailable due to technological limitations of the time, metadata sequencing allows investigators to analyze frequency, timing intervals, and clustering behavior. Certain patterns emerge that suggest heightened activity within a short pre-disappearance window, followed by abrupt cessation. This cessation becomes a key feature in the evolving model. It represents a transition point that aligns with other discontinuities in the timeline: the end of scent trail continuity, the last confirmed visual sighting, and the final cluster of reconstructed movements. Individually, each element is incomplete. Together, they converge toward a single unresolved moment. Public awareness begins to rise again, but in fragmented form. Small reports surface indicating renewed investigative activity, though no official confirmation is provided. Online discussions revive older theories, now filtered through new interpretations of previously released details. The case regains attention, but not clarity. For the family, updates become more structured and cautious. Investigators avoid definitive language, focusing instead on outlining progress in analytical reconstruction rather than evidentiary confirmation. There is movement, but it is still contained within investigative boundaries. No resolution is offered, but the tone of communication reflects a subtle shift. The case is no longer dormant. Internally, however, investigators begin to recognize a critical limitation. Despite all refinement, the central transition point remains unobserved. The exact mechanism by which presence became absence is still not directly supported by definitive evidence. Every reconstruction approaches it, but none fully captures it. This missing transition becomes the defining feature of the entire case. Efforts intensify to bridge this gap. Simulations are run repeatedly under varying assumptions. Each scenario attempts to account for all known data points simultaneously. Most fail under contradiction. A few remain partially viable but require assumptions that cannot be independently verified. One model, however, begins to gain cautious attention. It does not solve the case, but it reduces contradiction more effectively than others. It suggests a scenario involving structured timing alignment, environmental familiarity, and deliberate minimization of observable disruption. It does not name a perpetrator. It does not confirm intent, but it fits the structural constraints more closely than alternative explanations. Still, it remains a hypothesis. What makes this phase of the investigation different is not resolution but convergence. The number of viable explanations has narrowed significantly. The data no longer spreads outward. It compresses inward. And in that compression, the outline of what actually happened begins to take shape without yet becoming fully visible. Investigators describe this state as approaching coherence without reaching confirmation. The case is no longer fragmented, but it is not solved. It exists in a state where almost every component aligns, except the one that matters most. And that missing component, the transition from presence to absence, remains locked at the center of everything. As the seventh phase closes, one reality becomes increasingly unavoidable. The investigation is no longer searching across possibilities. It is circling a single unresolved point that all evidence now leads toward, but none fully illuminate. And within that silence, the case continues to hold its final answer, waiting for the moment when one remaining piece will either complete the structure or expose its final contradiction. By the eighth phase of the investigation, the case no longer expands outward. It tightens inward, like a system collapsing under its own weight, drawing every fragmented detail toward a center that still refuses to fully reveal itself. Investigators are no longer dealing with uncertainty in the broad sense. They are dealing with a concentrated absence, one that feels engineered by time itself, reinforced by every failed attempt to reconstruct it. The most significant development begins with something deceptively simple, a reclassification of old witness material that had been sitting in archives for years. During a routine audit of case documentation, analysts begin tagging statements according to reliability metrics, cross-checking them against modern behavioral interpretation models. What was once a flat collection of interviews becomes a layered dataset, capable of being reinterpreted through structure rather than memory alone. And in that restructuring, inconsistencies begin to cluster in ways that were not previously visible. Certain witness accounts, once considered independent, begin to show subtle alignment in timing and phrasing. Not identical wording, but similar structural patterns in recollection, pauses at the same conceptual points, uncertainty concentrated around identical time windows, and a recurring inability to define movement sequences with precision. On their own, these are minor irregularities. Together, they suggest something more unsettling, shared distortion of perception around a single critical interval. That interval, already defined in earlier phases as the disappearance window, now becomes even more constrained. Investigators reduce it further, not by assumption, but by elimination. Every verified external data point is reinserted into a unified timeline model. The result is a narrowing of the critical window to a span of minutes rather than hours. Within that compressed frame, all confirmed activity must fit. Everything outside it becomes either irrelevant or misremembered. And within that compressed frame, the case becomes more intense. Digital reconstruction efforts accelerate. Analysts revisit 2003-era infrastructure data, including outdated cellular routing patterns, traffic signal logs, and archived municipal records. Each dataset, when isolated, appears incomplete. But when layered together, they begin to produce a consistent directional flow of movement across the surrounding area. This is not clarity. It is alignment. And alignment is more dangerous than ambiguity because it suggests structure where none was previously confirmed. Inside the investigative unit, discussions become more focused, almost surgical. The language shifts again. Investigators no longer refer to possibilities in plural. They refer to models. Competing explanations are ranked based on how well they survive data pressure, not how plausible they seem in isolation. At the top of these models is one that continues to gain internal traction, not because it is confirmed, but because it absorbs contradictions more efficiently than others. It suggests a controlled sequence of events within the narrowed time window, dependent on environmental familiarity and precise timing coordination. It does not yet answer the central question of intent, but it reduces randomness significantly. Still, there is resistance to treating this model as dominant theory. Because every advancement in structure still lacks the one element required for completion: direct observational linkage. The transition point, the exact moment when presence became absence, remains unaccounted for. And it is here that investigators begin to realize something critical. The case is no longer missing information. It is missing continuity. Every known element exists on either side of that transition. Before it, there is presence, activity, movement. After it, there is absence, silence, discontinuation. But the bridge between those states has never been fully reconstructed. Efforts to resolve this gap intensify. Simulation teams begin running constrained environment models, attempting to replicate possible scenarios that could produce identical evidence patterns while preserving all known constraints. These simulations are not speculative in the traditional sense. They're bound by verified data points, forced to operate within strict temporal and spatial limits. Most scenarios fail immediately under contradiction. A few survive partial validation but collapse under secondary constraints, such as environmental inconsistencies or timeline overlap failures. One scenario, however, continues to persist through iterative refinement. It does not resolve the case, but it reduces contradiction more consistently than others. It suggests a sequence that explains the abrupt termination of multiple data streams simultaneously: scent discontinuation, visual absence, and communication cessation. The model implies a single coordinated disruption point within the narrowed window. Still, it remains theoretical. Meanwhile, forensic teams revisit physical evidence with renewed methodology. Advances in trace detection allow for reinterpretation of previously inconclusive samples. Microscopic residues are reanalyzed for compositional structure, revealing environmental markers that suggest repeated exposure to specific confined conditions. This does not identify a location directly, but it suggests that certain elements of the case may have intersected with controlled environments more than once during the critical time frame. That finding shifts internal focus again. Investigators begin reevaluating spatial assumptions. The disappearance is no longer viewed purely as a linear movement across geography. It is increasingly considered in terms of containment zones, areas where movement could have been restricted, altered, or interrupted without leaving conventional trace patterns. This introduces a new layer of complexity, because containment implies control, and control implies intention. At the same time, witness re-examination reaches another critical stage. One particular individual whose statements had previously been treated as consistent is now subjected to structured timeline reconstruction. Investigators do not challenge the content of the testimony directly. Instead, they reconstruct it against known external data points, asking whether the described sequence can coexist with verified environmental and temporal conditions. Under this method, small deviations begin to emerge. Not contradictions, but misalignments. A described movement that cannot be placed precisely within known traffic patterns. A recalled interaction that does not align with reconstructed signal data. A sequence of events that appears coherent in memory but unstable under structural verification. These misalignments accumulate slowly, building tension without crossing the threshold into direct inconsistency. Still, they are enough to deepen internal focus. The investigative team now operates with increased segmentation. One group focuses entirely on timeline integrity. Another focuses on spatial reconstruction. A third works exclusively on behavioral pattern analysis of key individuals. Each group produces partial convergence, but none can independently resolve the central gap. And the gap remains dominant. Publicly, the case begins to reemerge in fragmented form. Small media outlets report renewed investigative activity, though official statements remain limited. The lack of confirmation fuels speculation. Online communities begin reconstructing older theories with new interpretive frameworks, attempting to align publicly available information with perceived internal developments. Some interpretations come close to internal models. Others diverge significantly. But all reflect the same underlying reality. The case is no longer dormant. It is active again. For the family, the situation is carefully managed. Updates are more frequent, but deliberately restrained. Investigators avoid language that implies conclusion. Instead, they emphasize structural progress, timeline refinement, data convergence, analytical reconstruction. The emotional weight of the case is acknowledged indirectly, never directly addressed in terms of resolution. Hope exists, but it is controlled. Inside the investigative unit, however, the tone is different. There is growing awareness that the case is approaching a threshold point. Not resolution, but definitional clarity. A stage where the number of possible explanations becomes so limited that only a small set of structurally viable scenarios remain. And among those scenarios, one continues to dominate internal modeling. Not because it is proven, but because it survives constraints that eliminate others. Still, even this model does not resolve the central issue. It approaches the transition point but does not cross it. It explains alignment but not mechanism. It accounts for structure but not execution. The disappearance remains intact in its most critical form. The moment itself is still missing. And investigators begin to understand that this is no longer a question of finding more data. It is a question of interpreting existing data correctly under conditions of extreme compression. because everything now leads to a single point in time. A point that exists in every reconstruction, but is fully explained in none. As the 8th phase concludes, the investigation stands at a paradoxical position, closer to coherence than ever before, yet still separated from the one moment that would transform structure into resolution. And in that unresolved interval, the case continues to hold its silence, not as absence of information, but as resistance to final definition. Waiting for the moment when compression finally gives way to clarity or collapses into something entirely unexpected. By the 9th phase of the investigation, the case no longer feels like it is being examined. It feels like it is being compressed. Every layer of data, every reconstructed timeline, every reinterpreted statement is now being forced toward a single structural point that still refuses to fully reveal itself. Investigators describe it internally as convergence pressure, the sensation that too many independent threads are now pointing toward the same narrow interval in time, yet none are able to cross the final threshold into certainty. That interval, the disappearance window, is now measured with extreme precision. Not hours, not even a broad sequence of minutes. It is now defined as a tightly bounded segment of time where all known confirmed activity must fit. Outside that segment, everything is either verified earlier presence or verified later absence. The entire case now exists around this compressed transition. And that transition remains unaccounted for. The most significant development in this phase comes from a full-scale reconstruction audit. A dedicated team reprocesses every verified data point from the investigation using a unified timeline engine designed to eliminate redundancy and highlight contradictions. Unlike earlier reconstructions, this system does not prioritize narrative flow. It prioritizes structural consistency. Every event must align mathematically within time, space, and behavioral constraints. When the first full model is generated, the result is striking. Not because it provides answers, but because it eliminates almost every previously considered scenario. What remains is not a conclusion. It is a narrowing corridor of possibility so tight that only a handful of explanations remain structurally viable. Inside this corridor, investigators begin to notice something critical. The disappearance is no longer defined by what happened after the victim vanished. It is defined by what must have occurred during a span of minutes that contains too many converging variables to be accidental. Cellular reconstruction data, once treated as unreliable due to early 2000s infrastructure limitations, is now layered with environmental modeling corrections. Signal propagation behavior is recalculated using terrain-adjusted algorithms. Coverage distortion is accounted for. The result does not produce exact location tracking, but it produces directional consistency. And that consistency points repeatedly toward the same geographic cluster identified in earlier phases. But now, that cluster is no longer broad. It has been refined into a small operational radius where multiple independent data streams intersect: reconstructed movement probability, historical traffic density, and signal activity clustering. Within this radius, the likelihood of event concentration increases significantly. This is where the investigation shifts again. Because convergence is no longer theoretical, it is measurable. At this stage, investigators begin to redefine the problem. It is no longer about finding new evidence. It is about reconciling existing evidence that now refuses to diverge into separate explanations. Everything is pointing inward. And inward always leads back to the same unresolved element, the transition point. Efforts intensified to reconstruct that exact moment using layered simulation models. Analysts run thousands of iterations under controlled constraints, each simulation attempting to replicate a sequence of events that satisfies all known conditions simultaneously. Most fail immediately due to timing conflicts or spatial contradictions. Some fail later due to secondary inconsistencies in behavioral modeling. But a small subset of simulations continues to survive longer than expected. These surviving models share a disturbing characteristic. They all require a highly coordinated sequence of actions within a very narrow time frame. None of them rely on randomness. None of them allow for incidental deviation. Each one implies structure, timing discipline, and environmental familiarity. Still, they remain hypothetical. No direct evidence confirms any of them. Meanwhile, forensic reinterpretation reaches another subtle turning point. Previously analyzed trace materials are reevaluated under a new comparative framework that integrates environmental degradation models. This allows investigators to estimate how materials would have behaved or shifted over time under specific conditions. The results are not dramatic, but they are consistent. Certain trace patterns suggest repeated exposure to controlled environments rather than open or random settings. This does not identify a location, but it reinforces the idea that movement during the critical window may not have been unrestricted. And that changes how the disappearance is understood. It is no longer being modeled as a single event occurring in open space. It is increasingly being modeled as a constrained sequence occurring within limited environmental boundaries. That shift carries significant implications. Because constrained implies structure. And structure implies planning, or at least predictability. At the same time, behavioral analysis of key individuals continues under stricter computational review. Investigators do not focus on statements alone anymore. They analyze rhythm of communication, frequency distribution, and temporal alignment with known events. What emerges is not a confession or a contradiction, but a pattern of behavioral consistency that becomes more complex under deeper scrutiny. One individual in particular continues to stand at the center of overlapping data points, not because of any single piece of evidence, but because of cumulative alignment across multiple independent reconstructions. Their timeline intersects with multiple critical nodes within the narrowed window. Their known movements remain structurally compatible with the convergence zone. Their prior statements, when reanalyzed under strict sequencing models, contain small but persistent misalignments. None of this is sufficient for conclusion, but together, it creates a gravitational center within the dataset. Investigators begin to refer to this phenomenon internally as alignment density, the concentration of independent variables converging on a single profile without direct evidentiary confirmation. And alignment density is not proof, but it is rarely meaningless. Outside the investigative structure, the case begins to re-enter public awareness in a more organized way. Limited leaks, indirect confirmations of renewed activity, and resurfaced archival reports begin to circulate through media channels and online communities. The narrative that forms externally is fragmented, but increasingly focused. People sense that the case is no longer cold in the traditional sense. It is active but contained. For the family, communication becomes more structured and formalized. Investigators provide updates that emphasize analytical progress rather than operational breakthroughs. There is movement, but it is constrained. There is direction, but not resolution. Every conversation carries the same underlying tension, proximity without arrival. Internally, investigators begin to recognize a critical realization. The case is no longer expanding into unknown space. It is collapsing toward a single unresolved moment. And that moment is becoming increasingly defined not by missing data, but by the absence of a confirmable mechanism that connects all known points. Every reconstruction now leads to the same problem. Everything before the disappearance is increasingly coherent. Everything after it is stable and documented. But the transition itself resists reconstruction. It is the only part of the timeline that cannot be simulated without introducing assumptions that cannot be independently verified. And that makes it the central anomaly of the entire case. Efforts are made to refine models further, reducing degrees of freedom, tightening constraints, eliminating variables that introduce inconsistency. Each refinement improves structural clarity, but does not resolve the gap. Instead, it sharpens it, making the absence more visible, more defined, and more difficult to ignore. Investigators begin to describe the case not as unsolved, but as structurally incomplete. A case where nearly all components are accounted for except the one that determines causation. Because, without the transition point, the narrative cannot be closed. And as this phase reaches its end, the investigation stands at a critical threshold. Every major data stream has converged. Every viable explanation has been narrowed. Every alternative has been tested against constraints. What remains is a single unresolved interval of time, so tightly defined that it cannot be ignored, but still so poorly understood that it cannot yet be explained. And within that interval, the truth of 2003 continues to exist, intact and unreachable, waiting for the final piece that will either complete the structure or expose the final contradiction that has been hiding in plain sight all along. By the 10th phase of the investigation, the case is no longer expanding, no longer even strictly converging. It is stabilizing into a rigid structure of certainty around uncertainty, where nearly every known variable has been accounted for, yet the central mechanism of the disappearance remains completely unverified. Investigators describe it as a locked configuration, a system where all external inputs align, but the internal transition point refuses to resolve. At this stage, the investigation shifts from reconstruction to validation stress testing. Every previously accepted timeline is now subjected to extreme consistency checks. Analysts do not ask what likely happened anymore. They ask what version of events can survive total contradiction testing without collapsing under its own assumptions. And the answer, increasingly, is very few. The refined model of the final hours now operates within a narrow, almost surgical time frame. Every confirmed data point, visual sightings, communication logs, environmental traces, and witness statements, has been compressed into a tightly bounded sequence. Outside this sequence, nothing is uncertain. Inside it, everything is unstable. The disappearance window, once broad and ambiguous, is now reduced to a critical span measured in minutes. Within that span lies the unresolved transition, the moment when presence became absence. And despite 10 phases of reconstruction, that moment still has no confirmed mechanism. Investigators begin to refer to this as the zero-gap problem. It is the single interval in the entire timeline that cannot be directly reconstructed without introducing assumptions that break at least one verified constraint. In simpler terms, every attempt to explain it creates a contradiction elsewhere. That realization changes the tone of the investigation again. The focus is no longer on accumulating new data. It is on resolving structural incompatibility. Every piece of evidence already exists. The challenge is no longer discovery, it is reconciliation. To address this, a full system-level reconstruction is initiated. This is not a standard review. It is a complete reassembly of the case using integrated modeling, behavioral science frameworks, environmental physics simulations, communication pattern analysis, and temporal constraint mapping. Every known variable is fed into a unified model design to eliminate interpretive bias. When the system completes its first full output, investigators are confronted with something unexpected. Not clarity, not contradiction, but compression. Multiple independent scenarios collapse into a small cluster of structurally viable models. These models do not explain everything, but they explain more than any previous iteration. Each one satisfies the same constraints: timing consistency, spatial alignment, and behavioral plausibility under known conditions. However, they all share one unsettling feature. They all require a controlled disruption within the disappearance window. Not necessarily violent, not necessarily visible, but structured enough to produce simultaneous failure across multiple observable tracking systems: visual continuity, scent trace continuity, and communication continuity. This convergence does not prove what happened, but it significantly narrows what could have happened. At this point, investigators begin to reconsider earlier assumptions about randomness. The disappearance is no longer treated as an unpredictable break in pattern. It is increasingly treated as a system-level event, something that occurred within a defined structure of constraints, not outside of it. And that shift reframes everything. Witness testimony, once treated as fragmented perception, is now analyzed as behavioral response under stress conditions. Small inconsistencies in recall timing are no longer dismissed as memory decay alone. They are mapped against known cognitive distortion models. What emerges is not deception, but compression of perception around a single missing event. Interestingly, multiple independent witnesses show similar structural distortions in their recollections. Not identical memories, but similar gaps in sequencing. Similar uncertainty clusters around the same temporal zone. This suggests not coordinated misinformation, but shared exposure to an event that was too brief or too ambiguous to be fully encoded. That reinforces the idea that the transition itself may have occurred too quickly or too cleanly to be fully observed in real time. Meanwhile, forensic reanalysis enters its most refined stage. Advanced detection techniques isolate microtrace patterns previously considered irrelevant. These patterns are reevaluated under contextual probability models that account for environmental transfer, degradation timelines, and surface interaction dynamics. The results are subtle but consistent. Trace indicators suggest movement between controlled and transitional environments during the critical time frame. This does not specify exact locations, but it reinforces a constrained movement hypothesis rather than an open-range disappearance scenario. In practical terms, the investigation is now leaning away from randomness entirely. At the same time, behavioral profiling reaches a level of granularity not previously possible. Analysts construct multi-layered interaction maps that chart communication frequency, spatial proximity probability, and temporal overlap across all known individuals linked to the case. These maps reveal something important. Multiple independent data streams converge disproportionately around a single behavioral node. This node, one individual whose timeline repeatedly intersects with critical reconstruction points, remains central in internal analysis, not because of a single decisive piece of evidence, but because of cumulative structural alignment across independent systems of verification. However, even this alignment does not produce confirmation. It produces concentration. And concentration is not conclusion. Public awareness of the case increases again, but in a fragmented, almost speculative form. Leaked interpretations of renewed investigative activities circulate through media outlets and online communities. Each version of the narrative emphasizes different aspects of the case, but all share a common theme. The investigation is no longer stagnant. It is moving. For the family, communication becomes even more carefully controlled. Investigators now frame updates in terms of structural narrowing rather than investigative breakthroughs. The language is deliberate. There is progress, but it is not yet actionable. There is direction, but no endpoint. And beneath all of it remains the same unresolved reality. The transition point is still missing. At this stage, investigators begin to fully confront the central paradox of the case. Everything before the disappearance is increasingly explainable. Everything after the disappearance is fully documented. But the transformation between the two states remains unobservable. It is not simply missing evidence. It is missing continuity. And without continuity, causation cannot be established. Efforts are made to resolve this through increasingly constrained simulation environments. Each model is forced to operate under stricter assumptions, eliminating variables that introduce ambiguity. The goal is not to explore possibility, but to eliminate instability. As constraints tighten, the number of viable scenarios continues to shrink. Most collapse immediately under contradiction. Some survive partial validation but fail under secondary constraints. Only a few remain stable across all tested parameters. And those few all converge on the same structural implication. The disappearance required a highly constrained sequence of events occurring within a tightly bounded timeframe, with minimal external trace production and rapid systemic discontinuation of observable signals. This does not describe intent. It describes structure. And structure, in investigative terms, is often the most revealing layer of all. Still, even with this narrowing, the core problem remains unsolved. No model fully captures the transition point without introducing assumptions that cannot be independently verified. Every reconstruction approaches the moment, aligns around it, and then stops. The gap remains intact. By the end of this phase, investigators reach a quiet but critical understanding. The case is no longer about finding missing pieces. It is about interpreting a nearly complete structure that contains one irreducible absence. That absence is not noise. It is the defining feature of the entire case. And as the investigation pauses at the edge of resolution without crossing into it, one reality becomes unavoidable. The truth is no longer distant. It is compressed into a single unresolved moment that has been circled, reconstructed, and refined from every possible angle, yet still refuses to reveal how presence became absence in 2003. By the 11th phase of the investigation, everything has converged so tightly that the case no longer feels like an open inquiry. It feels like a sealed structure with one missing internal component, a mechanism that cannot function because a single critical link remains unverified. Investigators no longer describe progress in terms of discovery. They describe it in terms of final compression. The entire reconstruction now rests on a single, narrowed interval of time. A span measured not in hours, not even in broad minutes, but in a tightly defined sequence where every known data point, movement, communication, environmental traces, and witness perception must fit without contradiction. Outside this interval, everything is accounted for. Inside it, everything depends on a transition that still cannot be directly observed. That transition remains the central problem of the case. Despite 10 previous phases of refinement, the moment when presence became absence has never been fully reconstructed with independent verification. Every model approaches it. Every dataset points toward it. But none of them cross it in a way that satisfies all constraints simultaneously. And now, in this final phase of analytical pressure, investigators stop trying to expand understanding. They begin trying to eliminate impossibility. A full system reconciliation is conducted again, but with one critical difference. Instead of testing what might have happened, the system is now forced to test what cannot be disproven given all available constraints. This inversion produces a dramatically reduced solution space. Most previously plausible scenarios collapse immediately under contradiction thresholds. What remains is not a story. It is a structural outline. A sequence of conditions that must all be true simultaneously for the disappearance to remain consistent with all verified data points. First, the victim's last confirmed presence is locked within a narrow temporal boundary defined by multiple independent sources: environmental continuity, last observed movement patterns, and pre-disappearance communication and activity. This boundary is no longer debated. It is stabilized. Second, external environmental continuity, scent tracking, visual confirmation attempts, and early search responses, terminates abruptly within a geographically consistent zone. This termination is not gradual. It is discontinuous. That discontinuity is now recognized as one of the defining features of the case. Third, all subsequent data streams, communications, sightings, and traceable movement cease entirely. Not partially. Not intermittently. Completely. This triad of conditions creates something investigators have come to call a hard boundary event. A moment in time where multiple independent tracking systems all fail simultaneously within a confined spatial region. And yet, even with this structure, the mechanism behind that failure remains undefined. What changes in this final phase is not the data, but the interpretation threshold. Investigators begin to accept that the disappearance was not a gradual process. It was not a sequence of loosely connected events. It was a tightly bounded transition that produced immediate and total discontinuity across multiple observational systems. This realization forces a reevaluation of every earlier assumption. Witness testimony is reclassified not as fragmented memory, but as partial exposure to a highly compressed event. Individuals did not misremember the timeline. They experienced different fragments of a transition that occurred too quickly and too cleanly to be fully reconstructed from any single perspective. This explains the persistent structural similarity in witness uncertainty, not shared misinformation, but shared cognitive inability to fully encode a rapid system-level discontinuity. Forensic reinterpretation reaches its most definitive stage. All remaining trace evidence is now evaluated under a unified environmental transfer model that accounts for degradation, contamination probability, and spatial displacement. The outcome does not identify a perpetrator, but it reinforces one critical conclusion. The environmental context of the disappearance was not random. It was constrained. And constraint implies a defined operational boundary. This boundary becomes the focus of final spatial reconstruction. Analysts overlay every known data stream onto a refined geographic model of the disappearance zone. Within this model, overlapping signals begin to form a concentrated cluster of interaction probability. Not a pinpoint location, not a single point of certainty, but a tightly bounded zone where multiple independent systems all converge within acceptable error margins. Inside this zone, investigators reconstruct the final movement sequence again and again, testing variations against all known constraints. Each iteration removes ambiguity. Each iteration reduces possible outcomes. And each iteration leads back to the same unresolved transition point. At this stage, the case reaches its final analytical paradox. Everything is known except the mechanism that connects it. The system before the disappearance is stable. The system after the disappearance is stable. But the transformation between the two states remains unobservable without introducing assumptions that cannot be independently validated. And in investigative terms, that means the case is structurally complete but causally incomplete. Internally, this realization is not framed as failure. It is framed as limit condition. A boundary of interpretability where available data can no longer fully resolve causal sequence. The investigative team begins documenting final models, not to solve the case, but to preserve the most structurally consistent reconstructions of events based on all verified constraints. These models do not claim certainty. They represent convergent states, configurations where maximum available evidence aligns with minimal contradiction. Among these models, one emerges as the most stable. It does not explain every detail, but it accommodates the largest number of verified data points without structural collapse. It preserves timing integrity, spatial coherence, and behavioral consistency under all tested conditions. However, even this model does not define the transition itself. It only frames the conditions under which the transition must have occurred. The moment remains unseen. As the investigation reaches its final documentation stage, communication with the family is conducted in carefully measured terms. Investigators acknowledge progress in structural understanding but avoid definitive conclusions. They explain that the case has reached a point where all known data has been reconciled, but one critical interval remains unverified in mechanism. There is movement toward clarity but not resolution. Outside the investigative unit, the case enters public memory again, but differently this time. It is no longer viewed as an open mystery. It is viewed as a case that has been extensively reconstructed but not fully closed. Discussions shift from speculation to interpretation of known structure. The focus is no longer on what happened, but on how completeness can still exist without explanation of a central transition. And within that distinction lies the final understanding. Some cases do not remain unsolved because evidence is missing. They remain unresolved because one specific moment resists full reconstruction under any known system of verification. That moment, the transition from presence to absence in 2003, remains intact, unchanged, and unbroken by every layer of analysis applied over time. It is not hidden anymore. It is fully located within the structure of the case. It is simply not explainable with the information available. And as the final phase concludes, the investigation arrives at its ultimate position, complete convergence without causal closure. A case where everything is known except the single moment that defines everything else. And in that silence, the disappearance of 2003 remains exactly what it has always been, fully reconstructed in every direction except the one that matters most, still waiting for a form of explanation that has not yet been made possible.